when we had the last hearing, I didn't have a very happy discussion because we had a revelation come up about these non-disclosure agreements that the housing providers were requiring the tenants to sign on to before they'd settle anything that seemed to be a legitimate tenant complaint. And at that time, I asked everybody to go back and make sure over the next 30 days to have all of those NDAs rescinded. And if there was any private property housing provider that thought they had a great case, to call me up and come to my office and explain to me why they should have these non-disclosure agreements. I had nobody come to my office. I thought that I was assured that these have been rescinded, but this week I've got an email and another non-disclosure agreement from Monterey Bay where the practice has continued at least up until August. And Secretary McCarthy, we'll have a discussion about this because it's in your lane. But look, when I was, Ms. Fields, I think when you were responding to Senator Kane's question about the satisfaction surveys, if you have a non-disclosure agreement that says you can't speak even about the existence of the agreement and you can't speak disparagingly about the housing provider, then how does the answer to that question go?
That's a great question.
Right, which is why these damn things have to be eliminated. Now, I want to ask you all right now, can I get your assurance that you can go through your chain of command and go to your housing providers and say this ends immediately? And if you think you have a legitimate reason for having one, contact me. I'd love to hear the basis for that. I don't think there can be one. And I want your assurance that we're going to move forward with this. This is a part of the problem. Look, I have tried to be balanced every time I come in here. If you look at it, when these contracts started getting initiated back in 1996, you were conveying property that was owned by the government to a private housing provider. They were to fix some of them, the old units, maybe upfit them. They were to build new units. And they had to make a financial decision that ultimately resulted in an investment that private sector investors invested in. Great. Hopefully they made a good decision. Now, it may have been that in some cases, they simply didn't know what they were buying. You know, everybody that flips a house, sometimes you buy something and it worked out well, and sometimes it didn't work out so well. There may be a rational basis to go back to some of these housing providers and say, look, we may have sold you a bill of goods, and we have some responsibility for trying to smooth out the economic consequences of that decision. In other cases, they built houses that are the subject of the problem. We owe them not a dime to fix that. That's on them. So my question to you all is, when is enough enough? When do we finally look at these contracting vendors, consistent with what Senator Inhofe opened up with, and say, you know, it's time just to recognize that you're in breach of contract. We got to go a different way. All right, your business practices are to a point where we've got to go to a court of law and settle this. When is enough enough? Secretary McCarthy.
We might be there right now, sir.
Secretary Moodley.
Senator, I think that in certain cases we may be there. In other cases, I think there's a pretty heavy responsibility on the Navy and Navy leadership over the last couple of years in terms of not paying attention to it. So,
Secretary Barrett.
Senator, enough is enough. We have had enough. On some of these properties, they have worn out the patience of the Air Force. In other instances, they're doing a great job, and we're happy.
I agree, and I don't want to go too far over time, but I want to be fair. I don't want to all of a sudden let our passions sweep up private housing providers that seem to be doing a good job, trending in the right direction. But we probably need to make an example out of a couple of them, and just draw the line and move forward. And in the other cases, go back and figure out, Secretary Ryan, I think you're right. If we don't look at recapitalization, I'm not one who thinks that we should take this back over and go to the old ways because it wasn't working. And then Senator Perdue's point is well taken. Then all of a sudden, you guys have to rely on us to give you resources, and how's that worked out for you? So I think it makes more sense to provide some certainty by having these contracts in place. But we have to look at recapitalization. We have to go back and rationalize what is what should be a consistent model. To Senator Hirono's point, I know that these contracts were negotiated over time and there were differences. Some of them were learning from the past contracts. But at some point, we've got to go back and reopen this and aggressively pursue it. And I'm going to leave you with this. I don't know what other members have done it, but I've had town halls at Camp Lejeune. I've had town halls at Fort Bragg. I've had multiple sessions. I've literally met with hundreds of military families down on those two bases. And things are improving there. But I had at least one military spouse drive up from Fort Benning. And she said, we were here when you all started really shining light down at Fort Bragg. But now I'm down at Benning, and it's not so good. Sounds like it's improving. But I would encourage all of my colleagues in the Senate and in the House to go on base and cast light on these folks. It makes a difference. We're making progress, but we're not making it nearly as quickly as we should. And I really do believe it's time to draw a line with some of these vendors and some of these contracts and say enough is enough. Thank you, Mr. Chair.